The alarm had not even finished ringing when Commander Daniel Cross walked onto the training floor and said the words that would change everything for our squad. No mercy in training. I remember every detail of that moment, because I am not human. My name is Vexthal, and I come from a world where the sky is always calm and the ground never tries to kill you. I joined the Coalition training program to learn how humans fight, because every species in known space had learned, the hard way, that humans fight differently than anyone else. What I did not expect was to learn that lesson from a single recruit who barely spoke, barely smiled, and barely understood that the words, "no mercy," were supposed to be a figure of speech. Her name was Kira Voss. Before I explain what happened, you need to understand where we were. The Coalition training base sat on a moon called Thren, chosen because its gravity, its air, and its temperature were close enough to a dozen different homeworlds that no single species had an advantage. It was supposed to be fair, it was supposed to be balanced. Nothing about what happened that day was balanced. We stood in 3 rows on the sparring floor, a wide circle marked with blue light on the ground, surrounded by observation platforms where instructors watched every match. My row held recruits from 6 different species. To my left stood a Krathon named Doran, built like a wall of muscle and plating, easily twice the mass of any human present. To my right stood Owen Blake, a human recruit who had already earned a reputation for being calm under pressure, and 2 positions down from him stood Kira, quiet as always, watching the commander with an expression I could not read. Commander Cross was not a gentle man. He had fought in 3 border conflicts before taking this posting, and his voice carried the kind of weight that made even Krathon recruits stand a little straighter. That morning, he was in a mood. Reports said a Coalition patrol ship had been damaged near the edge of human space, and Command wanted every unit sharper, faster, and harder than before. He walked the line, stopped in the center, and raised his voice. Today we are done with the soft version of training. I have watched you all hold back. I have watched you tap out of holds you could have escaped. I have watched you pull strikes that should have landed. That ends now. From this point on, no mercy in training. Fight like your life depends on it, because one day it will. Most of us nodded. Some of us grinned, thinking this simply meant more effort, more focus, a little more sting in every exchange. This was how humans always spoke before training. Big words, big promises, and then the same structured drills as before, only slightly rougher around the edges. I had seen it a dozen times already during my 3 months on Thren, but Kira did not nod. She did not grin. She raised her hand, which surprised everyone, because she almost never spoke during formation. "Commander," she said, her voice flat and steady, "confirm the order. No mercy, no restrictions." Cross blinked, clearly not expecting to be questioned on something so simple. "That is what I said, recruit." "Confirm it again," she said, "for the record." A few recruits laughed quietly, assuming she was making some kind of joke. Cross did not laugh. He straightened his shoulders and repeated himself, slower this time, as if speaking to someone who had not understood him the first time. "No mercy in training, Voss. No restrictions. Fight to end the exchange, not to look good doing it." "Understood," she said. And that was the last thing she said before her first match began. I want to pause here and explain something about Deathworlds, because at the time, none of us truly understood what that word meant. We had all heard it used casually, the way you might describe a planet with strong winds or thin air. A Deathworld, in Coalition terminology, was simply a planet with conditions hostile enough that most species could not survive there without heavy technology. Most people assumed this meant tougher weather, stronger predators, harder terrain. What it actually meant, for the humans who came from such places, was something else entirely. It meant growing up in a place where hesitation was not a character flaw, it was a fatal mistake. It meant learning as a small child that the difference between an actual threat and a training exercise sometimes did not exist, because on a Deathworld, everything that looked dangerous usually was. Kira Voss came from a colony called Aldresh Hollow, a human settlement founded on a planet so hostile that the Coalition had almost refused to certify it as habitable. I did not know this yet, standing on that sparring floor. I only knew that something about her stillness made the air feel different. Her opponent that day was Doran, the Krathon recruit. Doran stood nearly 2 meters tall, with dense gray plating along his forearms and shoulders, plating that could take a solid hit without so much as bruising. In every match before this one, Doran had won easily, sometimes without needing his full strength. He looked at Kira with something close to amusement, the way a much larger animal might look at a much smaller one. The referee called the start of the match. Doran moved first, as he always did, closing the distance with a heavy forward step meant to push his opponent off balance immediately. Against most recruits, this worked within the first 2 seconds. Kira was not there when his strike landed. I have replayed this memory many times since, trying to understand exactly what I saw, because it happened faster than my eyes could properly track. She did not step back. She did not step to the side in the way we had been trained. She moved in, underneath his reach, using the small gap between his forward step and his balance shift, a gap that existed for perhaps 1/3 of a second. What followed was not a training exchange. It was a sequence of precise, controlled actions, each one targeting a specific point of vulnerability, delivered with a speed and certainty that left no room for reaction. Doran, despite his size and his plating, found himself unable to recover his footing, unable to reset his stance, unable to do anything except absorb one calculated action after another. The match ended in under 10 seconds. Doran was down, conscious but unable to rise, one arm held at an angle that made several recruits look away. The training floor went completely silent. Even the instructors on the observation platform had stopped talking. Medical staff moved in quickly, and I watched Kira step back from the circle without any visible reaction at all. No excitement, no satisfaction, no fear of what she had just done. She simply returned to her position in line and waited for the next instruction, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Commander Cross stood frozen for a long moment before he found his voice. "Someone explain to me what I just watched." No one answered right away. I looked around at the other human recruits, expecting shock equal to my own, but what I saw instead was something closer to quiet recognition. Owen Blake, standing near me, muttered under his breath, low enough that only I could hear. "That's just Kira." I turned to him. "What do you mean, that's just Kira?" He shrugged, his eyes still on the medical team, helping Doran to his feet. "She's from Aldresh Hollow. You don't grow up there and come out normal. She's not trying to hurt anyone on purpose. This is just what training looks like where she's from." I did not understand what he meant. Not fully, not yet. All I understood was that a single recruit had just taken down one of the strongest fighters in our unit in under 10 seconds, following an order that everyone else had treated as simple encouragement. Commander Cross called for a pause in the exercises. He walked over to Kira directly, and I moved close enough to hear the exchange, though I tried not to make it obvious that I was listening. "Recruit Voss," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled. "Do you understand what just happened?" "Yes, sir," she said. "I followed the order, no mercy, no restrictions. That order did not mean to seriously injure a fellow recruit." "You confirmed it twice, sir," she said, and there was no defiance in her voice, no attempt to argue or excuse herself. She was simply stating a fact. I asked for clarification because I did not want there to be confusion later. "You said no restrictions. I trained accordingly." Cross opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. I watched something shift in his expression, a recognition that he had, in fact, given exactly the order she described, and confirmed it not once but twice, in front of the entire unit. "We will discuss this after the session," he said finally, and turned to address the rest of us, his voice regaining its usual authority. "Everyone else, back into formation. We continue with modified rules. Full contact, controlled strikes, Standard safety protocols remain in effect. I noticed something interesting in that moment. He had just changed the order, quietly, without acknowledging that he was changing it. No mercy in training had become full contact with standard safety protocols within the span of a few minutes. Nobody said anything about the shift out loud, but everyone understood what had happened. The words had meant one thing when spoken to soldiers who treated them as motivation. They had meant something entirely different to a recruit who came from a place where words like that were not motivational speeches. They were survival instructions. The rest of that day passed in a blur of careful, restrained drills, everyone suddenly far more aware of exactly what was and was not being asked of them. I noticed how the other recruits kept a slightly wider distance from Kira during the remaining exercises, not out of unkindness, but out of a kind of instinctive caution, the way you might step carefully around something you did not fully understand. I found myself watching her for the rest of the session, trying to understand what I had witnessed. She moved through the remaining drills with the same quiet precision as before, but noticeably restrained, as if she were holding something back with real effort, the way someone might hold their breath underwater. It was not the movement of someone incapable of control. It was the movement of someone who had simply been told, moments ago, that control was not required and had to consciously choose to bring it back. By the end of the session, Doran had been cleared by medical staff, his injury manageable and already being treated, though he would need several days before returning to full training. He did not seem angry when he left the floor. If anything, he looked thoughtful, glancing back at Kira with something between respect and reassessment. As we filed out of the training hall, I fell into step beside Owen Blake, still trying to make sense of everything I had seen. "You said she is from a Deathworld," I said. "I have read about Deathworlds. I did not think the difference would be like this." Owen glanced at me, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked almost hesitant to answer. "It's not really something you can explain with numbers on a data file," he said. "Deathworld doesn't just mean dangerous. It means the danger never stops long enough for you to relax. Kira grew up somewhere like that. I don't know the details. Nobody really does. She doesn't talk about it much. But I know enough to say this. When someone like her hears an order like no mercy, she's not hearing a pep talk, she's hearing instructions." I thought about that for a long time after we left the training hall. I thought about the way Commander Cross had confirmed his own order twice, without understanding what he was authorizing. I thought about the quiet, careful way Kira had returned to formation after the match, as if what she had done was simply routine, simply expected, simply what training was supposed to look like. I did not know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The true consequences of that single order were still ahead of us, and they would reshape how our entire unit understood training, discipline, and the woman who had taken a simple command and followed it exactly as it was spoken. That night, lying in the recruit quarters, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying the match over and over in my mind. 10 seconds. That was all it had taken. 10 seconds to turn one of the strongest fighters on Thren into someone who needed medical attention, and to turn a routine training order into something the entire base would be talking about for days. I did not know yet whether to be afraid of Kira Voss, or simply to be grateful that she was on our side. The next morning, the training hall felt different before anyone even arrived. I noticed it the moment I stepped through the door, a kind of tension in the air that had not existed the day before. Word had spread fast across the base overnight. By the time our unit gathered for formation, recruits from other squads were already gathering near the observation platforms, pretending to check equipment while clearly waiting to see what would happen next. Commander Cross arrived exactly on time, his expression unreadable. He did not mention the previous day's events directly, but I noticed he chose his words with far more care than usual. "Today we continue combat conditioning," he said. "Full contact, controlled strikes, standard safety protocols in effect. I want clean technique, not unnecessary force." I glanced sideways at Owen Blake, who gave me a small nod, as if to confirm what I already suspected. The commander was speaking carefully now, choosing his language the way someone chooses their steps on unstable ground. He had learned, in the space of one match, that words meant something very specific when Kira Voss was listening. Kira herself stood in formation, exactly where she always stood, calm, quiet, giving no indication that she understood the shift in atmosphere around her. If she noticed the extra attention from other squads, she did not show it. The first several matches of the day passed without incident. Recruits sparred, instructors called corrections, and the usual rhythm of training returned, though everyone seemed to be moving with slightly more caution than before, as if the entire hall had collectively decided to take the rules more seriously. Then Kira was called for her second match. Her opponent this time was a recruit named Marcus Doyle, a broad-shouldered young man from a farming settlement on one of the outer colonies. Marcus had a reputation as a steady, dependable fighter, not flashy, not exceptional, but solid and consistent. He had sparred against dozens of recruits without ever losing his composure. Before the match began, I saw him glance toward Kira with a look of genuine unease, though he tried to hide it behind a confident smile. Standard rules, the referee reminded them both. Controlled strikes only. Kira nodded once. Marcus nodded as well, visibly relaxing slightly at the reminder. The match began, and this time, it looked almost normal. Kira moved with clear restraint, blocking, redirecting, using controlled pressure rather than the decisive force she had shown the day before. For the first time since I had arrived on Thren, I saw her fight in a way that resembled everyone else, careful, measured, respectful of her opponent's safety. The match ended with Marcus tapping out after a firm but harmless hold, and the entire hall seemed to exhale at once. Commander Cross allowed himself the smallest hint of relief, nodding toward Kira with something close to approval. "Good control, Voss," he said. "That is what proper technique looks like." I thought, at that moment, that perhaps the situation had resolved itself. Perhaps Kira had simply needed clear boundaries, and once given, she could operate within them without difficulty. I was wrong, though I would not understand exactly how wrong until later that same afternoon. During the midday break, I found myself sitting near Kira in the mess hall, something I had not done before. She ate alone most days, not out of unfriendliness, but out of what seemed like habit, a preference for quiet over conversation. I decided, perhaps foolishly, to ask her directly about what had happened. "Yesterday," I said, sitting across from her, "the match with Doran. Was that difficult for you? To fight like that?" She looked up from her tray, studying me for a moment before answering, as if deciding whether the question deserved a real response. "No," she said simply. "It was easy. What was difficult was this morning, holding back against Marcus." I did not expect that answer. Holding back was difficult? Fighting without restraint was easy? "Where I grew up," she said, setting down her utensil, "holding back gets people killed. You learn to commit fully to every action, every single time, because there is rarely a second chance to correct a mistake. What you saw yesterday was normal for me. What you saw this morning took real effort, real concentration, to make sure I did not do more than what was asked." I sat with that for a long moment, trying to understand the weight of what she had just told me. For most recruits, training was the difficult part, and normal life was the place where they could relax. For Kira, it seemed to be reversed entirely. Restraint itself was the skill she had to practice, not aggression. "Your homeworld," I said carefully. "Aldresh Hollow. What is it like there?" Something shifted in her expression, not quite sadness, but something adjacent to it, a kind of distant recognition of a place far away. "It is beautiful," she said, "and it does not forgive mistakes. The soil itself can be dangerous if you do not know how to read it. The plants have defenses that most off-worlders cannot imagine. The weather changes fast enough to kill anyone unprepared. Children there are taught, from the earliest age, that hesitation is not caution. Hesitation is simply a slower way of dying." I did not know how to respond to that. I had grown up on a world where the worst danger I ever faced was a particularly steep hillside near my childhood home. The idea of an entire childhood spent learning to survive constant threat was almost impossible for me to fully imagine, even as I sat across from someone who had lived through exactly that. "Does everyone from your homeworld fight the way you do?" I asked. She considered this. "Some more, some less. It depends on what part of the planet you come from, what dangers you grew up facing. But yes, in general, we do not train the way most coalition recruits train. We do not practice technique for its own sake. We practice survival, and combat is simply one part of that." Our conversation was interrupted by the call to return to the training floor for the afternoon session, and I found myself thinking about her words throughout the rest of the day, turning them over in my mind, trying to reconcile the calm, careful woman sitting across from me with the recruit who had ended a match in 10 seconds the day before. The afternoon session brought a new complication that none of us had anticipated. Commander Cross announced a squad exercise, a scenario designed to simulate a defensive engagement, where recruits would be divided into 2 teams and required to work together under time pressure. The stated goal was cooperation, not individual combat, a chance for recruits to practice coordination rather than one-on-one sparring. Kira was placed on a team with 3 other recruits, including a Zenari named Ilvash, someone from my own species, and 2 humans, Grace Bennett and Ethan Price. The opposing team included Owen Blake, Doran, now recovered enough to participate in light activity, and 2 others. The scenario called for one team to defend a marked position, while the other attempted to breach it within a set time limit, using padded equipment and controlled contact rules. It was meant to be a straightforward exercise in tactics and teamwork. From the very first moment, I could see Kira operating differently than everyone else on her team. While Ilvash and Grace focused on maintaining the defensive perimeter as instructed, Kira seemed to be constantly scanning for weaknesses, adjusting position, anticipating movement before it happened. She was not simply defending a marked line. She was treating the exercise as if their survival genuinely depended on the outcome. When Owen's team began their approach, Kira moved to intercept before anyone else on her team had even reacted. She did not wait for the attackers to reach the defensive line. She met them early, using the terrain of the training hall, a series of low barriers meant to simulate cover, to control the angles of approach. I watched, along with dozens of other recruits, as she systematically disrupted the attacking team's coordination, moving between positions with a speed that made it difficult to track her, using controlled but decisive contact to remove attackers from the exercise one at a time. She was not simply fighting. She was thinking several steps ahead, treating the scenario with the same seriousness she had shown in her actual combat with Doran. The exercise ended with her team successfully defending the position, though 2 of the attacking recruits required a short pause to recover from the intensity of the contact, even within the supposedly controlled rules of the drill. Commander Cross called an end to the scenario earlier than planned, gathering both teams for a debrief. I could see him weighing his words carefully before he spoke. "That was effective," he said, looking at Kira. "Perhaps too effective for a training scenario. Voss, I want you to understand something. These exercises exist to build cooperation and technique among the entire unit, not to demonstrate individual dominance." Kira listened without any visible defensiveness. "Understood, sir. I was defending the position as instructed." "You were defending the position," Cross agreed, "but with a level of intensity that made it difficult for your teammates to participate meaningfully. Ilvash and Grace barely had the opportunity to engage before the scenario ended." I saw Ilvash nod slightly at this, clearly relieved that someone had voiced the concern. Grace, standing nearby, added her own observation. "It's not that she did anything wrong exactly," Grace said. "It's just that fighting alongside her makes the rest of us feel unnecessary. She handles situations before we can even respond." Cross rubbed his forehead, and for the first time, I saw genuine frustration on his face, not directed at Kira specifically, but at the situation itself. "This is becoming a pattern," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Every exercise, Every scenario, the same result. I need to understand what I am actually working with here. He turned back to Kira. Recruit Voss. After this session, report to my office. I want to discuss your training history in more detail. Yes, sir, she said, without hesitation. The rest of the squad dispersed for equipment checks, and I found myself walking alongside Ilvash, who seemed eager to talk through what we had just witnessed. I have trained alongside many species, Ilvash said, his voice carrying the particular resonance common to our kind. I have never seen anything like this. It is not that she is simply strong or simply fast. It is that she seems to calculate every possibility before the rest of us have even recognized the situation. She told me it comes from where she grew up, I said. A world called Aldresh Hollow. She described it as a place that does not forgive mistakes. Ilvash considered this. I have heard of Deathworld colonies before, of course, but I had assumed the differences were mostly physical. Stronger bones, faster reflexes, that sort of adaptation. I did not consider that the difference might be psychological as well, a fundamental difference in how danger itself is perceived and processed. I thought about this as we continued walking. Perhaps that was the heart of what made Kira so different from the rest of us. It was not simply that she was more capable in combat, it was that she seemed incapable of treating any exercise, any scenario, any order, as anything less than completely real. Where the rest of us understood training as a structured simulation with built-in safety margins, she seemed to experience it as an extension of the same reality that had shaped her entire life, a reality where every threat deserved a complete and immediate response. That evening, I happened to be near Commander Cross's office when Kira arrived for her meeting, and though I knew it was not entirely appropriate, curiosity got the better of me. I lingered nearby, close enough to hear fragments of the conversation through the partially open door. Tell me about Aldresh Hollow, I heard Cross say, his voice more measured than his usual command tone. What would you like to know, sir? Everything relevant to how you were trained. I need to understand the source of what I am seeing on that training floor, because right now I am giving orders without fully understanding their impact on you specifically. There was a pause before Kira answered, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her before, something closer to genuine reflection than the flat, factual tone she usually used. My colony was founded 3 generations ago, sir. The planet was certified as a death world before settlement even began, but the location had valuable resources, and the founders believed the risk was worth it. They were partially right. We survived, but survival came at a cost. Every child on Aldresh Hollow is trained from the age of 5 in what we call full commitment response. It means treating every potential threat as if it is real, because hesitation, even for a fraction of a second, is often fatal. There is no concept of training versus reality where I come from. There is only response, correct or incorrect, fast enough or too slow. And here, Cross said, in a structured military training program with clear safety protocols, that instinct does not simply switch off. No, sir, Kira said, it does not. I can hold back when I understand clearly that restraint is expected. But when an order is given without qualification, when I am told there are no restrictions, my training does not allow me to interpret that as anything other than exactly what it says. I heard Cross exhale slowly. I gave that order carelessly. I did not consider that anyone in this unit would take it as literally as you did. With respect, sir, Kira said, I believe I took it exactly as literally as it was meant to be taken. The confusion was not in my interpretation. The confusion was in the assumption that all recruits share the same understanding of what an order like that requires. There was a long silence after that, and I decided it was time to move away from the door before I was noticed. I walked back toward the recruit quarters, turning her words over in my mind, along with everything I had learned that day. I realized, walking through the quiet corridors of the base that evening, that we had all been treating Kira Voss as a problem to be managed, an anomaly to be corrected, a recruit whose behavior needed adjustment to fit within our expectations. But listening to that conversation, I began to understand that perhaps the problem was not Kira at all. Perhaps the problem was that the rest of us had never truly understood the words we used so casually. Words like no mercy, words like full commitment, words that meant nothing more than encouragement to us, but meant everything, meant survival itself, to someone raised on a world that did not know how to forgive. I went to sleep that night, uncertain of what the coming days would bring, but certain of one thing. Kira Voss was not simply a talented fighter among us. She was a living reminder that the words we speak carry different weight depending on who is listening, and that some lessons, once learned in a place like Aldresh Hollow, could never be fully unlearned, no matter how many safety protocols surrounded them. By the end of that first week, the entire base had heard some version of the story, and like most stories passed from mouth to mouth, it had grown well beyond the original events. I heard recruits from other units whisper that Kira Voss had broken 3 bones in a single match, that she had been suspended from training entirely, that she had once fought an instructor and won. None of these things were true, but the exaggerations revealed something honest underneath them, a genuine unease that had spread through the base like a slow current beneath calm water. Commander Cross called a full unit meeting on the 7th day, gathering all of us into the briefing hall rather than the training floor. I could see immediately that this was different from our usual morning formations. Chairs had been arranged in rows, and Cross stood at the front with a datapad in his hand, his expression serious in a way that suggested careful preparation rather than spontaneous frustration. "I want to address something directly," he began, "because I believe letting rumors continue unchecked does more harm than confronting the truth. Recruit Voss has not violated any regulation. She has not been disciplined, and she will not be, because in every instance she followed the orders given to her exactly as they were stated." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "The failure here was mine. When I said no mercy in training, I intended it as a call for greater intensity, greater effort, a push against complacency. I did not consider that among the recruits standing before me was someone raised in conditions where those words carry a very different, very literal meaning. That is a gap in my own judgment, not a fault in Recruit Voss's conduct." I watched several recruits exchange glances at this, clearly surprised to hear a commander take responsibility so directly in front of the entire unit. Cross was known for many things, but public acknowledgement of his own mistakes was not usually one of them. "Going forward," he continued, "all orders given during training will include explicit parameters. When I say controlled contact, I mean controlled contact. When I say full intensity, I will specify exactly what that means in terms of acceptable actions. This is not a special accommodation for one recruit. This is a correction to how I should have been communicating with this entire unit from the beginning, given that we represent multiple species and multiple backgrounds, each with different understandings of common military language." He looked out at all of us, his gaze eventually settling on Kira, seated near the back of the hall, her posture straight, her expression unreadable as always. "Recruit Voss, is there anything you would like to add?" She stood, which surprised me, since she rarely spoke unprompted in group settings. "Only that I understand the concern some of you have. I am aware that training beside me has changed since the incident with Doran. I do not intend harm toward anyone in this unit. I only intend to follow the instructions given to me as accurately as I understand them. If clearer parameters help avoid confusion, I welcome that change." She sat back down, and the hall remained quiet for a long moment before Cross moved on to other unit business. I noticed, though, that something had shifted in the room. The careful distance recruits had been keeping from Kira seemed to soften slightly, not disappear entirely, but soften, as if the honest acknowledgement from both the commander and Kira herself had diffused some of the tension that had been building all week. That did not mean every problem disappeared, however. Over the following days, I began to notice a different kind of difficulty emerging, one that had nothing to do with Kira's combat ability and everything to do with how the rest of the unit related to her outside of training. During mealtimes, I noticed that fewer recruits sat near her than before. even though her behavior itself had not changed. During free hours, when recruits gathered in the common areas to relax, play games, or simply talk, Kira remained largely absent, either staying in her quarters or spending time alone in the training hall practicing forms by herself. I decided, one evening, to seek her out during one of these solitary practice sessions. I found her in a corner of the training hall, working through a series of movements alone, slow and deliberate, nothing like the explosive speed I had witnessed during her actual matches. "May I watch?" I asked, standing near the entrance. She glanced at me, then nodded once, continuing her practice without further comment. I sat on a nearby bench and observed as she moved through what appeared to be a structured sequence, each motion connected to the next, though the overall pattern was unfamiliar to me. "What are you practicing?" I asked, once she paused to catch her breath. "Control forms," she said. "From home, they are meant to slow the body down, to teach patience and precision rather than speed and commitment. We practice them specifically to develop restraint, since restraint does not come naturally to most people raised on Aldresh Hollow. Does it help, here in this environment?" She considered the question seriously before answering. "Somewhat. It is difficult to unlearn instincts that were built for survival. But I recognize that here, among people who did not grow up the way I did, my instincts can cause problems that were never intended. I am trying to find a way to keep what makes me effective without making everyone around me uncomfortable." I found myself genuinely moved by this admission. She was not simply following orders blindly, as some in the unit had begun to assume. She was actively working, on her own time, without anyone requiring her to do so, to bridge the gap between who she had been raised to be and who her current environment needed her to become. "Why do you spend so much time alone?" I asked. "The others would likely welcome you if you spent more time with them outside of training." She lowered her gaze slightly, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something that resembled genuine vulnerability cross her expression. "I do not want to make anyone uncomfortable," she said quietly. "I have seen the way they look at me, the way conversations pause when I enter a room. I understand it. I do not blame them for it. But it is easier, for everyone, if I simply keep to myself outside of required activities." I did not have an immediate response to that, but something in her words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. It struck me that the very qualities that made her exceptional in combat, the qualities that had likely saved her life many times on a hostile world, were the same qualities now isolating her among people who did not share her background, and who did not know how to relate to someone shaped by such different circumstances. The following week brought a new development that changed the trajectory of everything happening within our unit. Coalition Command announced a joint field exercise, a multi-day operation combining several training squads into a single larger unit, designed to simulate coordinated response scenarios across varied terrain. This was a significant step up from our usual training hall sessions, involving actual movement across the moon's surface, simulated obstacles, and extended engagement scenarios lasting hours rather than minutes. Commander Cross gathered our unit the day before departure to brief us on the exercise parameters. "This exercise will test coordination, endurance, and tactical thinking across an extended time frame," he explained, standing before a projected map of the exercise zone. "Unlike our previous sessions, this will involve multiple squads working both independently and together, responding to scenarios that will unfold over the course of 2 full days." He went through the specific rules of engagement carefully, more carefully than I had seen him explain anything before, clearly mindful of the lessons learned from the previous weeks. Every parameter was defined explicitly. Contact levels were specified for each phase of the exercise. Communication protocols were laid out in exact detail. I noticed him glance toward Kira several times during this briefing, as if silently confirming that his instructions left no room for the kind of literal interpretation that had caused complications before. She listened attentively, nodding at the appropriate moments, giving no indication of confusion or concern. The following morning, our unit boarded transport vehicles for the journey to the exercise zone, a section of Thren's surface that had been specifically modified to simulate varied combat environments, from open plains to dense structural mazes designed to mimic urban settings. I found myself seated near Ilvash and Owen Blake during the transport, and our conversation naturally drifted toward the upcoming exercise. 2 full days, Owen said, checking his equipment for the 3rd time since boarding. That's longer than anything we've done before. I wonder how this changes things, with everyone spread out across a larger area instead of confined to the training hall. Perhaps it will be good for her, Ilvash said, glancing toward the back of the transport where Kira sat quietly, looking out at the passing landscape. A larger environment, more room to operate without everyone watching so closely. Perhaps she will feel less pressure to hold back so tightly. I considered this. Or perhaps a larger, more realistic scenario will simply give her more opportunities to demonstrate the very intensity that made everyone nervous in the first place. Owen shrugged. Either way, we'll find out soon enough. The exercise zone, when we arrived, was more impressive than I had anticipated. Coalition engineers had constructed an elaborate simulated environment, complete with structures designed to mimic settlements, open areas meant to represent contested terrain, and even a section built to resemble the interior of a starship, presumably for scenarios involving boarding actions or internal security responses. Our squad was assigned to work alongside 2 other training units for the duration of the exercise, bringing the total number of recruits involved to nearly 40 individuals from a dozen different species. Commander Cross introduced us to the other unit commanders, and I could see him having a brief, quiet conversation with them before the exercise began, likely explaining the situation with Kira in advance, ensuring that no one issued careless orders without understanding the potential consequences. The first day of the exercise proceeded in phases, each one testing different aspects of coordination and tactical response. Our squad performed well throughout the morning phases, working through simulated patrol scenarios and coordinated movement exercises without significant incident. Kira participated fully, contributing meaningfully to each scenario without the kind of overwhelming intensity that had characterized her earlier matches. I began to believe, as the day progressed, that perhaps the careful new protocols had successfully addressed the earlier concerns. Perhaps, given clear boundaries and a larger operational context, Kira could integrate fully into the unit without the disruptive intensity that had marked her first days of training. That belief was tested during the afternoon phase, when our combined units were assigned a scenario simulating a defensive engagement against a simulated hostile force, represented by another training unit assigned to play the role of opposition. This scenario was more complex than anything we had attempted before, involving actual movement across varied terrain, communication between multiple squads, and extended engagement over nearly 2 hours. Commander Cross had briefed us extensively on the rules, emphasizing repeatedly that this remained a training exercise, that all contact would be simulated using training equipment designed to register hits without causing genuine harm, and that the goal was tactical learning, not individual dominance. Kira was assigned to a forward position alongside myself and 3 other recruits, tasked with monitoring one flank of our defensive perimeter while other elements of our combined force managed the remaining approaches. For the first hour of the exercise, everything proceeded according to expectation. We received simulated contact reports, adjusted our positions accordingly, and communicated regularly with command elements coordinating the overall defense. Then, during the second hour, something shifted. Reports began coming in of the opposition force making unexpected progress along a sector we had not anticipated, moving faster and more aggressively than the scenario planning had predicted. Command elements began redirecting resources to respond, and the pace of the exercise accelerated rapidly. I watched Kira's demeanor change the moment the reports of unexpected opposition movement came through our communication channels. Something in her posture shifted, a subtle tightening, a shift in focus that I had come to recognize from our earlier conversations. She was no longer simply participating in a structured exercise. Something in the uncertainty of the moment, the genuine unpredictability of the opposition's movements, had triggered a different mode of engagement within her. "Command wants us to hold this position and wait for reinforcement," one of our squad members relayed over comms. Kira's response was immediate. "Holding position here creates a vulnerability if the opposition reaches the secondary access point before reinforcement arrives. We should advance to intercept." Command said to hold, the other recruit repeated, uncertain. I could see Kira weighing this instruction against her own assessment of the tactical situation, and for a moment I feared we were about to witness another instance of literal interpretation overriding practical judgment. But then, to my surprise, she paused, visibly restraining herself, and simply repeated the concern through proper channels. Requesting clarification from command, she said into her communicator, "Current position vulnerable to secondary access point if opposition maintains current trajectory. Recommend authorization to adjust." The response came back quickly, an actual acknowledgement of her tactical assessment, and command authorized a modest repositioning to cover the vulnerability she had identified. I watched, somewhat relieved, as she executed this adjustment through proper coordination rather than unilateral action, working with the rest of our small team to establish the new position efficiently. This, I realized, represented genuine progress. She had recognized a legitimate tactical concern, communicated it appropriately, and waited for authorization rather than acting purely on her own instinct. It was a small moment, easily overlooked amid the larger chaos of the exercise, but it struck me as significant, evidence that the careful, deliberate practice she had been doing alone in the training hall, the control forms meant to build patience and restraint, were beginning to bear fruit. The exercise continued for another hour before the scenario concluded, and our overall combined force performed well, successfully defending the assigned position while adapting to the unexpected movements of the opposition force. During the debrief that evening, Commander Cross specifically praised the tactical adjustment our small team had made. "That repositioning saved us significant complications," he said, addressing our team directly. "Good tactical thinking and good communication in requesting authorization rather than acting independently." I saw Kira accept this praise with the same quiet composure she brought to everything, but I also noticed something else. A small, almost imperceptible shift in her posture, something that might have been genuine relief, or perhaps even quiet pride, difficult to identify given how rarely she showed such things. That night, as our unit set up temporary camp within the exercise zone for the remainder of the two-day operation, I found myself sitting near a small gathering of recruits from different squads, sharing rations and discussing the day's events. To my surprise, Kira joined this gathering, sitting slightly apart from the main group but close enough to be considered part of it, the first time I had seen her voluntarily join a social setting since I had known her. Owen Blake noticed this as well, and made a point of including her directly in the conversation. "That call you made today, about the secondary access point, how did you see that coming before command did?" Kira considered the question before answering. "Where I am from, you learn to read terrain instinctively, to recognize points of vulnerability before they become active threats. It is not something unique to me. It is simply how I was trained to observe an environment." "Must be strange," Owen said, "coming from a place like that, and then training here, where everything is so structured, so careful." "It is an adjustment," Kira agreed. "But I am learning. I recognize that the instincts which kept me alive on Aldrich Hollow are not always appropriate here, and I am trying to find the balance between what makes me effective and what makes me someone others can work alongside without fear." I saw several recruits exchange glances at this admission, and something in the group's dynamic shifted subtly, a recognition, perhaps, that the woman they had spent the past 2 weeks treating with cautious distance was, in fact, working hard, in her own quiet way, to bridge exactly the gap they had all been worried about. As the conversation continued into the evening, covering everything from home planets to favorite foods to shared frustrations about specific training exercises, I found myself reflecting on how far we had come since that first day, when a single order, spoken carelessly and confirmed without full understanding, had nearly torn our unit apart before it had even properly formed. We still had one more day of the field exercise ahead of us, and none of us yet knew that the true test of everything we had learned, everything Kira had been practicing, everything Commander Cross had been trying to correct, still lay ahead, in circumstances none of us could have predicted, where the careful lines between training and reality would disappear entirely, and where the very instincts that had once seemed so alarming would become the only thing standing between our unit and genuine disaster. Morning arrived on the second day of the field exercise with a thin layer of mist covering the simulated terrain, and I woke to the sound of our unit preparing for the day's remaining scenarios. I found Kira, already awake, sitting near the edge of our temporary camp, watching the mist settle over the distant structures built to resemble a small settlement, the location of that day's planned exercises. "You are up early," I said, sitting down near her. "I never slept much, even at home," she said. "Aldrich Hollow does not have quiet nights. You learn to stay alert, even during rest, because rest is when threats often find you unprepared. Do you still feel that way here, even though Thren is safe?" She considered the question. "Less than before, but old habits take time to fade. I am working on it." I found myself genuinely curious about her life before the Coalition, and given the openness she had shown the previous evening, I decided to ask more directly than I had before. "What made you decide to leave Aldrich Hollow, to join the Coalition military?" She was quiet for a long moment before answering. "My colony has a tradition. Once every few years, a small number of young adults are selected to represent our world within the wider Coalition, both to bring honor to our settlement and to learn skills that might eventually help improve conditions at home. I was selected 3 years ago. I did not fully want to leave, but I understood the importance of the opportunity, both for myself and for my family." "Do you miss it, despite everything you have described about how dangerous it is?" "Every day," she said simply. "It is my home. Danger does not make something less like home. It simply makes home something you understand differently than people who grew up somewhere safe." I did not have an immediate response to that, and we sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the mist slowly burn away under the rising light of Thren's distant sun, until the rest of our unit began stirring and preparing for the day's activities. Commander Cross gathered all participating units for a final briefing before the day's exercises began, outlining a more complex scenario than anything we had attempted the previous day, involving simulated civilian evacuation procedures combined with defensive tactics, meant to test our ability to protect non-combatants while managing tactical threats simultaneously. "Today's exercise will be the most demanding scenario of this training cycle," Cross explained, standing before the assembled recruits. "You will be divided into response teams, each responsible for managing a simulated settlement sector during a staged crisis event. Your objectives include protecting simulated civilian personnel, played by support staff, while responding to opposition forces attempting to disrupt the evacuation process." He went through the specific parameters carefully, as had become his practice since the incident with Doran, ensuring every instruction left no room for ambiguous interpretation. I noticed him specifically address the protection of civilian personnel with particular emphasis. "Under no circumstances," he said, "will contact be initiated against personnel identified as civilians during this exercise, regardless of their actions or apparent behavior. Your role is protection, not engagement with anyone marked as non-combatant." He looked toward Kira as he said this, and she nodded once, her expression as composed and attentive as ever. Our unit was assigned to manage a sector designated as a residential zone within the simulated settlement, tasked with coordinating the safe movement of civilian personnel toward a designated evacuation point while responding to opposition forces attempting to prevent this movement. I found myself grouped again with Kira, along with Ilvash, Owen Blake, and Grace Bennett, the same general team configuration that had worked well during the previous day's exercise. The scenario began with our team receiving reports of civilian personnel scattered throughout our assigned sector, requiring careful coordination to guide them safely toward the evacuation point while monitoring for opposition activity. This proved to be a genuinely complex challenge, requiring us to balance the competing demands of protection, communication, and tactical awareness. For the first hour, everything proceeded smoothly. We located civilian personnel systematically, guided them toward the evacuation route, and maintained awareness of the broader tactical situation through regular communication with command elements. Kira performed admirably throughout this phase, demonstrating the same careful restraint and thoughtful communication she had shown the previous day. Then, during the second hour, the scenario introduced a complication that none of us had anticipated. Reports came through that opposition forces had managed to infiltrate our sector, disguised among the civilian personnel, requiring us to identify genuine threats while continuing to protect actual non-combatants, a distinction that proved considerably more difficult than the straightforward scenarios we had practiced before. I watched Kira's focus intensify as this complication emerged, her attention sharpening in a way that reminded me of her demeanor before the match with Doran. But this time, rather than acting on instinct alone, she paused, visibly working through the problem with the same deliberate control I had witnessed the previous evening. We need a reliable method to distinguish genuine threats from civilian personnel before initiating any response, she said to our small team, her voice steady and measured. Acting on assumption risks harming actual non-combatants, which violates the explicit parameters of this exercise. Command is asking for status updates, Owen said, checking his communicator. They want to know if we have identified the infiltrators yet. Not with certainty, Kira replied. I have observed behavioral inconsistencies among several individuals in our sector, but inconsistency alone is not sufficient grounds for engagement, especially given explicit instructions regarding civilian protection. I found myself impressed by this response, recognizing how far she had come from the recruit who had ended a training match in 10 seconds only 2 weeks earlier. She was applying the same careful analytical thinking that had made her so formidable in combat, but channeling it now through patience and verification rather than immediate decisive action. We continued working through the scenario methodically, gathering information, communicating observations to command, and gradually narrowing down the likely infiltrators among the civilian personnel in our sector. This process took considerably longer than immediate action would have, but it reflected exactly the kind of careful, measured approach the exercise was designed to teach. Eventually, working together as a team, we identified 2 individuals among the civilian personnel whose behavior consistently deviated from expected patterns, individuals who appeared to be monitoring our movements and communication rather than genuinely seeking evacuation assistance. Kira relayed this assessment to command, requesting authorization before taking any action. Command confirms your assessment, came the response over our communicator. Those 2 individuals are indeed opposition infiltrators. You are authorized to engage using standard training contact protocols. Even now, with explicit authorization, I watched Kira approach the situation with measured restraint, using controlled training equipment to neutralize the simulated threats without any of the intensity that had characterized her earlier matches. The engagement concluded quickly and cleanly, without incident, and our team successfully completed the remainder of the evacuation scenario without further complication. During the debrief that followed this phase of the exercise, Commander Cross specifically highlighted our team's handling of the infiltration complication. That was exactly the kind of careful, verified response this exercise was designed to encourage, he said, addressing our team directly. Rather than acting on assumption or instinct alone, you gathered information, communicated with command, and confirmed your assessment before taking action. That is the standard I want to see across this entire unit going forward. I noticed him look specifically at Kira as he said this, and something in his expression suggested genuine satisfaction, perhaps even relief, at witnessing this kind of measured, verified decision-making from someone whose instincts, only weeks before, had seemed to bypass such careful consideration entirely. As the day's exercises continued, I found myself reflecting on the transformation I had witnessed over the preceding weeks. Kira had not become a different person, not fundamentally. The same sharp awareness, the same capacity for decisive action, the same deep well of combat capability shaped by her upbringing on Aldresh Hollow remained entirely intact within her. What had changed was her ability to channel these qualities appropriately, to recognize the difference between situations requiring immediate, uncompromising action and situations requiring patience, verification, and careful coordination with others. This distinction, I realized, was perhaps the most important lesson of the entire training cycle, not just for Kira, but for our entire unit. We had all learned, in various ways, that effective military service required more than raw capability. It required judgment, the wisdom to recognize which tool the situation demanded, whether that tool was overwhelming decisive force or careful measured restraint. That evening, as our combined units gathered for a final meal before concluding the 2-day field exercise, I noticed a marked difference in how Kira was received by the broader group. Recruits from other squads, who had heard the stories about her but never interacted with her directly, seemed genuinely curious rather than wary, several approaching to ask about her performance during the day's scenarios. Doran, fully recovered from his injury weeks earlier, approached her directly during this gathering, and I watched their exchange with particular interest, curious how the Krathon recruit would react to the woman who had ended their match so decisively. "I wanted to say," Doran began, his deep voice carrying the particular formality common to Krathon speech, "that I have reflected considerably on our match. I do not hold resentment toward you. If anything, I have gained respect for what your training represents. I have adjusted my own approach to combat since that day, recognizing weaknesses in my technique that I had not previously acknowledged." Kira listened to this with evident attention, and when she responded, her voice carried a warmth I had not heard from her before. "I did not intend to cause you harm beyond what the situation required. I am glad you have found value in the experience, even though I regret the manner in which it occurred." "No regret necessary," Doran said. "I followed the same order you did. The difference was simply in how thoroughly each of us understood what that order actually meant. I have learned from this, as I believe has our entire unit." This exchange, small as it was, represented something significant to me, a genuine reconciliation between two recruits whose first encounter had been so dramatic, and a broader sign that our unit was finding its footing, learning to integrate the vastly different backgrounds and capabilities each of us brought to this training program. Commander Cross addressed the combined units one final time before we prepared to return to the main training facility, reflecting on the lessons of the 2-day exercise. "What I have witnessed over these past 2 days," he said, "represents exactly what this training program is meant to achieve. Not uniformity, not identical approaches from every recruit, but the ability to recognize when different approaches are appropriate, and the wisdom to apply the right response to each specific situation. This unit has grown considerably over the past several weeks, and I am genuinely proud of what I have seen." As we boarded transport vehicles for the return journey to the main facility, I found myself sitting near Kira once again, and I noticed a subtle but genuine change in her demeanor, a relaxation in her posture that I had not seen before, as if some of the weight she had been carrying since that first incident had finally begun to lift. "You seem different," I said, more at ease. She considered this observation carefully before responding. "I believe I am beginning to understand something I did not fully grasp before joining the coalition. On Aldresh Hollow, there is only one correct response to any threat: complete and immediate commitment. Here, I am learning that strength is not simply about the intensity of your response. It is about the wisdom to match your response to what each situation actually requires. I do not believe I have fully mastered this yet, but I believe I am learning." I smiled at this, genuinely pleased by the progress I had witnessed over the preceding weeks. I think this entire unit has learned something from watching you learn that lesson. She looked out the transport window at the passing landscape, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something that might have been genuine contentment cross her expression. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "I hope that is true." None of us yet knew how soon that hard-won wisdom, that delicate balance between restraint and full commitment that Kira had worked so diligently to develop, would be tested in circumstances far more serious than any training exercise could simulate. The peaceful weeks of structured training on Thren were coming to an end, and what awaited our unit next would demand everything Kira had learned, along with everything that had made her who she was, long before she ever arrived at this coalition training facility. 3 weeks after the field exercise concluded, our unit received orders that changed everything. Commander Cross gathered us in the briefing hall early one morning, his expression carrying a gravity I had not seen since our very first day of training. "Our unit has been selected for an actual deployment," he announced, and I felt the room shift around me, the atmosphere transforming instantly from routine training briefing to something far more serious. A coalition transport vessel, the Meridian Star, has requested escort through a sector recently flagged for increased pirate activity. This is not a simulation. This is a genuine operational assignment. I glanced around the room, watching the reactions of my fellow recruits. Some looked excited, others visibly nervous, and Kira, seated near the front, remained perfectly still, her expression giving nothing away, though I noticed her hands had tightened slightly against the edge of her seat. "This deployment represents the culmination of your training," Cross continued. "You have spent months developing the skills, the judgment, and the discipline necessary for genuine military service. I have confidence in this unit, and I have confidence in each of you individually. We depart within the hour." The journey to the Meridian Star took the better part of a day, and I spent much of that time reviewing operational protocols alongside the rest of our unit, trying to quiet the nervous energy building within me. This would be my first genuine deployment, the first time everything I had learned would be tested against real stakes rather than training scenarios. I found myself seated near Kira during a portion of the journey, and I noticed she seemed unusually quiet, even by her typical standards. "Are you nervous?" I asked. She considered the question. "Not nervous exactly, but aware that this is different. Training prepares you, but it cannot fully replace the weight of genuine consequence. I am simply preparing myself mentally for that difference." We arrived at the Meridian Star without incident, and our unit was distributed across the vessel according to the escort protocols established by Commander Cross, with small teams assigned to monitor key sections of the ship, while the larger transport made its way through the flagged sector. I was assigned alongside Kira, Owen Blake, and Ilvash to monitor the vessel's lower cargo section, considered one of the more vulnerable points for potential unauthorized entry. For the first several hours of the journey, everything proceeded without incident. We maintained our assigned positions, communicated regularly with command elements coordinating the overall escort operation, and monitored the ship's systems for any indication of approaching threats. Then, during what should have been a routine shift change, alarms began sounding throughout the vessel. "Unauthorized vessel detected on approach vector," came the announcement over the ship's communication system. "All escort personnel to designated defensive positions. This is not a drill." I felt my pulse quicken immediately, the reality of the situation settling over me with sudden weight. This was no longer a training exercise with carefully managed parameters and safety protocols. This was genuine danger, unpredictable and real. Our team moved quickly to secure the cargo section, taking up defensive positions near the primary access point, the most likely route for any unauthorized boarding attempt. I could hear Commander Cross's voice over our communicator, coordinating the broader defensive response across the vessel. "Unidentified vessel has made contact with the Meridian Star's hull near the secondary docking port," Cross reported. "All teams maintain defensive positions. We do not yet know the nature or intent of this contact. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness as we waited, weapons and training equipment replaced now with genuine defensive tools appropriate for actual operational deployment, our small team maintaining careful watch over the access point we had been assigned to protect. Then we heard it, a distant but unmistakable sound of forced entry, metal straining against metal, coming from somewhere further along the ship's lower sections. "They have breached the secondary docking port," came the report over our communicator, tension evident even through the filtered audio. "Unidentified hostile personnel confirmed aboard the Meridian Star. All teams, this is a genuine hostile engagement. Repeat, this is not a drill." I felt something shift in the air around our small team, a recognition settling over all of us that everything we had trained for was about to be tested in the most serious way possible. I glanced toward Kira, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something I had not seen before, not the carefully restrained composure she had worked so hard to maintain during training, but something else, a quiet, focused readiness that seemed to draw on something deeper than anything I had witnessed on the training floor. "They will likely attempt to move through this section toward the cargo hold," Kira said, her voice steady but carrying a new intensity. "The layout of this vessel makes this corridor the most efficient route between the breached docking port and the valuable cargo stores. We should expect contact here within minutes." Owen checked his equipment, his hands slightly unsteady, understandable given the circumstances. "Command wants us to hold this position and wait for reinforcement from the upper sections." Kira nodded, and I noticed something in her demeanor that reminded me powerfully of our very first conversation weeks earlier, her explanation of what it meant to grow up on a world that did not forgive mistakes. This was, in every meaningful sense, exactly the kind of situation her entire upbringing had prepared her for, a genuine threat requiring complete and immediate commitment, not the careful, measured restraint appropriate for training exercises among fellow recruits. We did not have to wait long. Sound of movement echoed from the corridor, leading toward our position, and moments later, several figures emerged, moving with the deliberate caution of individuals expecting resistance, armed and clearly intent on reaching the cargo section beyond our defensive position. What followed happened faster than I could fully process in the moment, though I have replayed it countless times since in my memory. Kira moved first, and unlike every training match I had witnessed over the preceding weeks, there was no restraint in her movement now, no careful calculation of appropriate force for a controlled exercise. This was exactly the full commitment she had described to me weeks earlier, the complete and immediate response that her upbringing on Aldresh Hollow had instilled as the only acceptable way to face genuine danger. She closed the distance to the lead intruder before he could properly bring his weapon to bear, using the same precise, decisive technique she had demonstrated against Doran, but without any of the careful restraint that had characterized her recent training performances. The intruder was neutralized within seconds, and she moved immediately to the next, her movements flowing seamlessly from one target to the next, with a speed and certainty that left the remaining intruders struggling to respond effectively. I found myself moving to support her, along with Owen and Ilvash, but it quickly became apparent that Kira alone was managing to control the majority of the engagement, her actions creating openings that the rest of us used to secure the remaining intruders as they attempted to retreat or regroup. Within what felt like less than a minute, though it likely lasted somewhat longer given the intensity of the moment, our small team had successfully neutralized the entire group of intruders attempting to breach the cargo section, securing the corridor and preventing any further advance toward the valuable stores beyond. Commander Cross's voice came through our communicator moments later, tension evident in his tone. "Status report from cargo section. Threat neutralized," Kira reported, her voice remarkably steady given what had just occurred. "4 hostile personnel secured. Corridor and cargo section remain protected. No injuries among our team." There was a brief pause before Cross responded, and I could hear something in his voice that sounded almost like disbelief. "Understood. Excellent work." Reinforcement teams are converging on your position now to secure the hostiles for transfer to holding. As reinforcement teams arrived to take custody of the neutralized intruders, I found myself standing near Kira, still processing the intensity of what had just occurred. She stood quietly, her breathing steady, watching as the reinforcement teams secured the area, and I noticed none of the visible effort or strain that had characterized her restraint during training exercises. This, I realized, was simply her natural state, the mode of operation she had spent years developing on a world that offered no alternative. "Are you all right?" I asked, once the immediate situation had stabilized. She turned to look at me, and something in her expression carried a complicated mixture of emotions, relief perhaps, along with something that might have been quiet satisfaction at having successfully protected our position, and underneath it all, a kind of weariness that suggested the intensity of the moment had cost her something, even if her physical performance had shown no sign of strain. "I am fine," she said. "This is what I was trained for. What I have struggled with these past weeks was learning restraint, learning when this level of commitment is not appropriate, but when genuine danger is present, when there is no ambiguity about the nature of the threat, this is simply who I am." Owen, standing nearby, looked at her with open admiration. "That was incredible. I have never seen anyone move like that. You saved this entire section single-handedly." "We worked together," Kira corrected gently. "I created openings, but all of you secured the results. This was a team effort, exactly as it should be." I appreciated her humility in that moment, though the reality of what I had witnessed made clear that her individual contribution had been the decisive factor in our team's successful defense of the cargo section. Without her particular capabilities, shaped by years of surviving genuine danger on Aldrich Hollow, our team might well have struggled considerably more against the armed intruders we had faced. Commander Cross arrived personally within the hour, once the immediate crisis had been fully resolved and the captured intruders had been secured for eventual transfer to proper coalition custody. He found our small team still stationed near the cargo section, completing final security checks before standing down from the heightened alert status. "Recruit Voss," he said, approaching directly. "I want to speak with you privately, but first, I want to say this in front of your team. What you did today likely prevented significant loss, both to coalition property and potentially to lives, had those intruders successfully reached the cargo section and secured a foothold aboard this vessel. This was exactly the kind of decisive, appropriate response that a genuine crisis demands." "Thank you, sir," Kira said simply. Cross studied her for a moment longer before continuing. "I remember, weeks ago, giving a careless order on the training floor, an order that caused considerable disruption and required significant adjustment throughout this unit. I remember confirming that order twice, without understanding what I was truly authorizing. I want you to know that I do not regret those weeks of difficulty, because what I have witnessed today convinces me that everything this unit learned during that period, including the hard lessons about restraint and judgment that you personally worked so diligently to develop, prepared us for exactly this moment." He paused, glancing toward the rest of our small team before continuing. "You did not simply follow an order literally on that first day, Recruit Voss. You demonstrated, from the very beginning, a capability and a commitment that this unit desperately needed, even if none of us, myself included, fully understood how to properly channel that capability at the time. What I witnessed today shows me that you have learned to apply that same capability with precisely the judgment and restraint appropriate to each situation, whether that situation calls for careful patience or complete, decisive commitment." I watched Kira absorb this acknowledgement, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something that resembled genuine emotion break through her usually composed exterior, a subtle but unmistakable softening around her eyes, perhaps the closest thing to visible pride I had witnessed from her throughout our entire training cycle together. "Thank you, sir," she said again, and this time her voice carried a warmth that had been absent from her earlier response. "I have worked hard to understand what this unit needed from me, and to become someone capable of providing that. whether the situation called for restraint or for exactly what happened today. As the remaining hours of our journey aboard the Meridian Star passed without further incident, I found myself reflecting on the entire arc of events since that first careless order on the training floor weeks earlier. I thought about the confusion and unease that had spread through our unit in those early days, the careful distance recruits had maintained from Kira, the quiet, solitary practice sessions she had undertaken to develop the restraint that did not come naturally to someone raised on a world that offered no room for hesitation. I thought about Commander Cross's growing understanding of the responsibility that came with commanding recruits from such varied backgrounds, the recognition that words carrying simple encouragement for some carried genuine, literal weight for others. I thought about Doran's gracious acceptance of what had happened between them, and the mutual respect that had eventually developed from what began as a jarring, difficult encounter. Most of all, I thought about Kira Voss herself, a young woman shaped by a world that demanded complete commitment as the price of survival, who had spent weeks learning, patiently and deliberately, to recognize when that complete commitment was appropriate and when careful restraint served better, and who had, when genuine danger finally arrived, proven capable of applying exactly the right response at exactly the right moment. Our unit returned to the main training facility on Thren several days later, the deployment successfully concluded, the Meridian Star safely delivered to its destination without further incident. As we disembarked from our transport, I noticed a change in how the other recruits regarded Kira, not the wary distance of those early weeks, but something closer to genuine respect, earned not simply through her exceptional capability, but through the visible effort she had demonstrated in learning to wield that capability wisely. That evening, gathered with the rest of our unit for a meal in the common hall, I found myself sitting beside Kira once again, much as I had during those early, uncertain days when I had first tried to understand what made her so different from the rest of us. "You have come a long way," I said, "since that first day on the training floor." She considered this, a small, genuine smile crossing her features, the first true smile I had witnessed from her throughout our entire time together. "I have learned that strength alone was never going to be enough. I needed to learn wisdom as well, the wisdom to know when to hold back and when to commit completely. I believe I am still learning that lesson, and I suspect I will continue learning it for the rest of my career in this uniform. I think this entire unit learned something from watching you learn," I said. "I know I did." She looked around the common hall, at the recruits from a dozen different species and backgrounds, all gathered together, sharing a meal after a genuine operational deployment that had tested every one of them in different ways. "Perhaps that is the true purpose of a unit like this," she said quietly. "Not simply combining our different capabilities, but learning from each other's differences, until each of us understands not only our own strengths, but when and how to apply them for the benefit of everyone around us." I raised my cup in a small, informal toast, a gesture I had learned from observing human customs during my time in the Coalition. To learning, then, and to a commander careless enough to give an order none of us fully understood, and to a recruit determined enough to take that order exactly as it was spoken. Kira raised her own cup, and for the first time since that fateful morning on the training floor weeks earlier, I saw her laugh, genuine and unguarded, the sound carrying through the common hall like something finally, fully at ease. "To learning," she agreed, "and to a commander who learned, eventually, to say exactly what he meant." Across the hall, Commander Cross, sharing a quiet meal with several other officers, glanced toward our table, and though I could not be certain from that distance, I believed I saw him smile as well, perhaps recognizing in that small, shared laughter the true measure of what our unit had become since that first, careless order had set everything in motion. We had all learned something during those weeks on Thren, something that no training manual could have fully taught us. We had learned that words carry different weight depending on who is listening, that strength without wisdom can be as dangerous as weakness, and that sometimes the most valuable lessons come not from careful, controlled instruction, but from the honest, difficult process of learning to understand someone whose entire life had prepared them for a world completely unlike our own. And somewhere, far across the stars, on a hostile world called Aldresh Hollow that did not know how to forgive mistakes, I imagined a colony of people who would have been proud, in their own quiet way, to know that the lessons they had taught their daughter had, in the end, helped protect an entire ship, an entire crew, and an entire unit of recruits who had finally learned to understand exactly what she had always known to be true. Some things, once learned on a world that never forgives, can become the very strength that saves everyone else, if only given the patience, the wisdom, and the chance to be properly understood.